I want to talk in the next couple of segments. I'm not quite sure if I'll be able to complete my discussion of the subject. I want to talk about Shakespeare's great work, Macbeth, one of his most political plays, and a play with a deep and interesting subject relevant to our current situation, the issue of tyranny. I have to say that for most of my adult life, I have routinely thought of America as a free society. But now, for the first time, I ask myself, are we really living in a free society? Take a number of our basic liberties. Well, we can't take them for granted. We can't exercise them. And I'm obviously thinking about free speech, which now is corralled or controlled in many ways in the public square. You can't talk about not just one or two things, but a whole menu of things. But also your religious freedom, your freedom of assembly, your freedom to not be persecuted by the government, to have equal rights under the law. All of this is open to question. So I wouldn't say we're living in a tyrannical society, but I would say that we are moving in the tyrannical direction. And this is, I think, why Macbeth remains perpetually, and especially now, interesting to us. Now, Abraham Lincoln considered Macbeth to be Shakespeare's greatest play, which is just another way of saying that it was his favorite play. Quoting Lincoln now, he goes, "Nothing equals Macbeth." Now, it's a very interesting statement by Lincoln because when you think of Shakespeare's plays, most people would say that you've got King Lear, you've got Othello, you've got Hamlet. Yes, Macbeth is in that category of the great tragedies, but there are also great history plays, there are great comedies. So what is it about Macbeth that Lincoln found so interesting? I want to suggest that what Lincoln found so interesting is that Macbeth is about the temptation to tyranny, a temptation that is not merely felt by a monarch who is in a position perhaps to become a tyrant, but is really felt by even leaders in democratic societies. Lincoln felt himself the temptation to tyranny, the temptation to belong, as he once put it, to the tribe of the eagle or the lion. In other words, the king of the forest that sort of has his way with all the other animals in the kingdom. Lincoln knew about this. He talked about this in his speeches. And I think Lincoln felt that temptation himself, a temptation that he had to overcome, the temptation to become. In fact, there are some Confederates at the time, and even some subsequently, who said Lincoln became a tyrant. I don't think he did, but he understood tyranny. And I think part of the reason he understood it so well is because of Macbeth. Now, Shakespeare's work is so abundant that his comedies have elements of tragedy. His tragedies will have comic scenes in them. You have histories like Richard III that are tragic certainly in their unfolding, in the murders that take place. And then you have plays that are hard to classify. The Merchant of Venice. It's not really a comedy. You wouldn't call Shylock a comic figure, although there are characters in the play who see him that way. Neither is it really a tragedy per se. In fact, it has a sort of satisfactory ending in the sense that that Portia brings about a favorable result. Antonio is not unjustly killed. Bassanio marries Portia. So some people have called The Merchant of Venice a romance, which I think is also an inadequate term. But one of the things we can say about Shakespeare's work is that it satisfies Samuel Johnson's definition of a classic. Samuel Johnson said a classic is a work that survives the provinciality of its own moment in space and time. That even if you go to other places or other times, a classic will still be interesting. And that is true of Shakespeare. A classic is a work that sort of refuses to go away. And we see that to be very true of Macbeth. In fact, at one point, Lincoln was even reading sections of Macbeth to his own cabinet. Now, the remarkable thing about Macbeth is that it is a study of tyranny, but from a very unusual point of view. It's a study of tyranny from the point of view of the tyrants themselves. Shakespeare has a sort of interesting script writer's direction in a number of his plays. You'll see this, for example, in Hamlet. You'll see it in Richard III. The instruction is enter two murderers. And what he's usually describing is someone that's been deputized by Richard, or deputized by some evil person to go out and murder some other people. The murderers aren't always named. They're just sort of bad guys, and their job is to come on stage and kill people. But interestingly, this description, the stage direction, enter two murderers, can also describe the whole of Macbeth. Enter two murderers, Macbeth himself and his wife, Lady Macbeth. And as I say, this is a story that is psychologically told from their point of view. They dominate the action. You see their minds at work. So Shakespeare, while he discusses tyranny in other cases, Julius Caesar is perhaps not a tyrant, but he's clearly on his way to becoming a tyrant. That's why Brutus and Cassius assassinate him. But Caesar is a very minor figure in Julius Caesar. He says a few pompous and declaratory things. You get the idea that he very much sees himself in charge. At one point, he's offered a crown, but he playfully goes, no, I'm not going to take it. And that's the only window you get into Caesar. The play is really much more about the assassins. It's about the psychology of Cassius, the psychology of Brutus. Richard III gives you a kind of almost stereotypical villain, a delightful and interesting villain. Richard is a remarkable kind of play actor. In fact, he tells you before he does something evil, kind of, here's what I'm going to do, check me out. And then he goes and does it. And after he does it, he gives kind of, you could almost call it dramatic commentary, artistic criticism of his own performance. I mean, it's remarkable how he lets the audience onto the stage, so to speak. And it's fascinating. But again, Richard is not presented as psychologically complex in the sense that he says, essentially, I'm deformed. God sent me out into the world with a crooked back, and essentially he implies I've got a crooked nature to go with it, and that's the end of the matter. That's all you need to understand about Richard, is he's an evil guy who's going to go about doing evil things, kind of like Iago. There's no explanation for why Iago is so envious, why he really wants to get rid, why he wants to destroy Cassio, why he wants to destroy Othello. That's just Iago. He's sort of pure evil. He's evil personified. But this is not the case with the Macbeths, either with Macbeth himself or with Lady Macbeth. And Shakespeare here is attempting something extremely difficult, because it is kind of easy to depict tyranny from the point of view of the victim, but it is not easy at all to show tyranny from the point of view of the tyrant. I mean, try to imagine, let's say, doing a play on World War II or even the Holocaust from Hitler's point of view. I mean, no one would even attempt it. It would be sacrilegious and scandalous beyond belief. And the idea that you could somehow probe the complex psychological motivations for evil, this is something that I think modern writers would shrink from, would run away from. But Shakespeare, and this is part of the sort of deep genius of Shakespeare, he's like, I'm going to go there. I'm going to show you the destructive effects of tyranny, not just on the victims, but interestingly on the tyrants themselves.